My name is Sabrina Smyth, and I'm super happy to see so many of you guys here on this beautiful Vancouver day. And I know that my friends up here at the front were telling me not to tell this terrible joke, but I'm gonna go ahead and tell this terrible joke and stop recording me. So about a month ago, there was daylight savings, and in Vancouver, that basically means that we gained an extra hour of rain. Thank you for that. You guys are very kind and gentle. I appreciate that. So first, I'd like to start off by acknowledging that we are actually gathered here today on the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. So if we can take a moment. So today's event is actually part of a conversation on confronting the disinformation age, which is actually hosted by the SFU's Public Square Community Summit and also co-presented by the Media Democracy Days. So a super exciting 12-portion event, and this summit has 12 different events, and the last one actually ends on the 18th of April, which is super exciting. And the overall event series basically focuses on disinformation and the pollution of our information ecosystem. And each of these events focus on a different aspect of disinformation, from like the complexities of this problem to some of the causes to even some of the solutions. So many of you guys in the audience are probably thinking like, why does this matter to me? And I have three main reasons as to why this matters to you. The first one is that we've all witnessed an uptick of very powerful companies that are using our data in ways that we would have never imagined before. For example, we're all aware of the real-world political fallout that our friends down south in the border are facing with, all because of disinformation. The second reason why you should care about the disinformation age today is because, as Canadians, our upcoming election is coming up. And what does that mean? Yet another target for the use of misinformation to achieve, their political ends in a way that's very unfair. And as you know, Canada has already been targeted for cyber attacks and fake news, propaganda, all during this current federal election cycle. The third and last reason why you should care is because our current democracy is being attacked. Our traditional information sources undermined, and our social media lives are being manipulated. Let that sink in. So while you're listening to our guests today, I want you to do me a favor and think of ways that you can personally counter the spread of disinformation, and potentially some steps that we can collectively make in order for us to ensure that our elections remain free and fair. So back to the speakers. After hearing from our speakers for around 40 minutes, they're gonna be having a conversation. We're gonna be opening up the floor for a Q&A session where you get to ask your very concise and brief question. Please leave your comments at the very end. And for the sake of our future online audience, please ensure that you're speaking directly into the mic. And with that being said, I would like to start off by introducing our first speaker. And it is my great honor to introduce to you our moderator today, Anita Bathe. She is both co-host and frontline investigative reporter with CBC Vancouver News at 6. As well as being a very passionate journalist, she's known for chasing breaking news stories and giving citizens a voice. Mrs. Bathe is part of a committed team dedicated to bringing viewers not only the news of the day, but also fresh perspectives on community stories that matter most to them. And our second speaker, it is my great pleasure to introduce to you today our guest, Christopher Wylie. He is the former director of research for Cambridge Analytica. And if you remember, back in 2018, he worked with The Guardian and The New York Times as a whistleblower to expose how social media data was being exploited and turned against ordinary citizens. He is currently the Director of Research for H&M, the largest global fashion brand. So with that being said, please help me join Christopher Wylie and Anita Bathe.
We have to turn it on.
Hello. Hi.
Thank you so much for being here today. I'm thrilled to be your moderator for this event with Christopher Wylie. So let's get started because we only have about 45 minutes for my questions and then we turn to you, the audience. So please make sure you're thinking of everything and anything that you want to ask him because you won't have a whole lot of time to do that. So Christopher, I want to start with the abuses of artificial intelligence. How dangerous is it really for all of us here today and around the world?
So I think that, you know, one of the things that often we talk about is, you know, how AI and targeting is being used in, you know, developed Western countries. But I think if we take a step back and actually look at, you know, some of the cases where, for example, Facebook's infrastructure was misused to catalyze and propagate particularly anti-Muslim hate propaganda in places like Myanmar, where, you know, the United Nations said that, you know, it contributed to the ethnic cleansing that was happening there, and that Facebook didn't actually take any action. When you look at, you know, how, you know, a lot of these platforms are contributing to the substantial increase in mental health issues, particularly amongst young people, I think that there is a significant public safety and public health aspect to AI systems when they're unleashed onto a population without proper testing and vetting. So beyond even just looking at its clear effects on the disinformation and misinformation environment that we see in politics, there are clear safety issues at play also.
And what are some of those safety issues that pertain to Canadians specifically? Do you have any examples?
I think that, you know, Canada, like a lot of other countries, you know, is just as much at risk to, for example, hostile foreign states or non-state actors in the alt-right promoting and propagating disinformation. You know, Canada is a NATO country. It has a lot of soft power in terms of its special relationship with the United States. And there are a lot of countries, Russia and China included, who have clear political interests in influencing the political discourse that happens in this country. But I think also, you know, taking a step out and going, actually, you know, misinformation can be things like the anti-vax movement, where it doesn't necessarily have a as clear a political agenda as, you know, a Russian disinformation campaign, but nonetheless, if that means that, you know, Canadian children don't get vaccinated at the same rate that they would otherwise, which then creates a public health risk, you know, Canada is just as susceptible to that as any other country. And I think also, when you look at the discourse that's been happening in Canada versus the United States or the UK or the EU, it hasn't been discussed nearly as much. Compared to, you know, the level of discussion that's happening in Britain or the EU or the United States right now. And I think, you know, there's sort of a tendency for, and I speak as a Canadian myself, you know, to sort of point to the United States and go, look at those Americans, they have all those problems, and not kind of take a step back and go, we are just as susceptible. And if we don't recognize that we are susceptible to these problems, you know, that's where problems can occur. And
that makes us more vulnerable.
Yeah.
That being said, the election is coming up in October, federal election. How is artificial intelligence, disinformation, how is all of that going to, in your opinion, affect the Canadian election?
Well, I don't know. And I think actually that's the problem, is that no one can really say, because when you look at how targeting and just in general advertising works on social platforms, we are sort of at the mercy of these large American tech companies to show us what's happening or not show us what's happening, right? There's no way for you as a journalist to go and interrogate the advertising and the targeting that's happening on these platforms. And we are just handing over blind trust to companies that literally won't do anything even when ethnic cleansing is at play. You know, this is the standard that this company has. Like, and so that is the problem. We can't say because it is a closed system. There's no way to see what is happening on these platforms, even though it is very much affecting political discourse. And so I think that's a problem.
You don't know how it's going to affect the election, but you do believe that it will?
Well, when we look at very clear examples from other countries, right? So there's countless examples in the EU or in the United States or in the UK where, you know, foreign state-funded propaganda campaigns were proliferating social media platforms. And it's not just the United States that gets targeted. You know, you see it in Finland, you see it in Sweden, you see it in all these small European countries just as much as you do in the United States. So I don't think, I think it's reasonable to look at Canada's geopolitical role and go, all right, there's probably interests of several countries to influence the result. And I think it's also reasonable to say that, you know, because we need to demand more transparency from these platforms in order to see what is actually happening, right? We can't know until they show us.
I want to get into a little bit more later about transparency and what we should be demanding from these giant tech companies. But first, you've been talking a lot about segregation. So separating out information, micro-targeting different groups of people. It's not stopping. You know, some would say, you probably will say, it's getting worse.
Yeah.
How does doing that risk segregating society?
Well, so when you look at sort of the mantra of Silicon Valley about this notion of hyper-personalization leading to higher levels of engagement, you know, and when you talk about AI that's used in marketing to segment, I mean, in marketing is literally called consumer segmentation. Another word for that is segregation. And I say that because it's not that, you know, company A or campaign A is literally segregating people. It's the platform itself that begins to classify people and start to shift and curate information for those people that is different from other people, right? And when you look at, you know, I had a conversation with a member of Congress a couple months ago, and one of the things that he said is, he goes, I don't get the big deal, like, it's just a bunch of ads, right? And I said, well, all right, well, what's the big deal? It's just where you sit on a bus. It's which entrance into a building that you can go into. It's where you can sit in a movie theater. The power of segregation is that when you create different worlds, you know, when you create multiple Americas, for example, where people start to see people as other and start to experience the same country or the same place very differently, that's where, you know, problems can occur and a lot of abuses can occur. You know, when you look at what happens in, you know, a precursor to ethnic violence often is ghettoization and segregation. And so when you look at what's happening online, right, where all these platforms want to constantly personalize content for you and people like you, where you start to see certain things that other people don't see, I think that creates the same kind of risk, particularly when you look at the fact that, you know, people on average look at their phones, you know, over 100 times a day. People go to bed with their phones. They sleep with their phones more than they sleep with people, right? So, like, you know, I mean, how many times do people, you know, have gone to bed and the last thing that you see is a screen, and you wake up and the first thing that you see is a screen, right? So not, you know, and not necessarily contemplating that the news feed that you're seeing is actually the product of a piece of AI that's trying to optimize your engagement, where it's treating you as a type or as a classification of people, and you are being treated in a different way than other people. And then if that means that you start to see certain things that other people don't see, you get the same effect of having several different understandings of the reality that exists. And if you no longer have a commonly shared reality, you completely eviscerate the potential, you know, the possibility of functioning political discourse. Because my America or my Canada or my Britain is different from yours, and we can't even agree on is something happening or not happening.
And people don't realize that this is happening to them.
No, because it's an architecture, right? It's not, you know, it's very hard to see the decision making that's being done in the back end of a platform because it's a bunch of code that you don't actually get access to. And again, because the adverts and it's not just the adverts, it's literally how everything is positioned for you, and your news feed, and whichever how things are laid out is positioned for you. So it's not just ads, it's literally the entire layout. And there's no transparency in how that works and why it is that you're seeing that. And there's no transparency not only for you, but I think more importantly for journalists and civil society to interrogate the way this works.
But is there anything positive about micro-targeting and having that personalization? People like it.
Yes. So I don't think that engagement rates are an innate moral good. Smoking has a fantastic engagement rate. But it doesn't mean that that's a good thing, right?
But is there anything positive about this?
So if we're talking about positive uses of targeting, yeah, I think there are positive uses of targeting. In a political context, when you look at the Obama campaign, how it was able to reach out to people from typically disenfranchised communities who don't regularly vote, despite the fact that they're often most affected by public policy making, and encouraging them to go and participate in elections. I think that's a positive, healthy use of data. I just also think that there is a huge risk that we are now wading into, where it's not just a campaign, it's also state actors and non-state actors who are also now part of this collective information mix, where you've got platforms that just blindly let loose their AI systems without properly testing them, which then creates this sort of catalyzing effect of hate propaganda in lots of places. The same thing happened in Sri Lanka. Sri Lankan government asked Facebook, from the cabinet of Sri Lanka, formally sent a request to Facebook and said, your platform is being used to spread hate propaganda, delete these accounts. And they didn't read it because it was in Sinhalese. So this is the problem, is that actually the entire informational space now is at the sort of mercy of these companies in Silicon Valley. And if they don't respond to ethnic cleansing, I think that that just shows where they're at and what they care about and what they prioritize.
We were just talking earlier, and you told me about what happened yesterday on YouTube. Can you share that with the audience?
Yeah, so YouTube set up a live stream of Notre Dame burning, because why not? People will watch that. And the algorithm that they set up originally to tackle fake news, with the idea that if you watched a video of a particular topic, it would send pop-ups of facts from Wikipedia about whatever, 9/11 or what have you, and it associated the video of Notre Dame burning with the comments, which were a lot of oh, it was probably the Muslims, it was probably Islamic terror. And so it started prompting these pop-ups about 9/11 and Islamic terrorism, even though it was a video of this cathedral burning in a completely unrelated context. But what that means, and every American who would go and see this video would see these pop-ups. And so the problem with that is then all of a sudden you're priming people to start thinking, oh, is it terrorism? Is it ISIS? Is it Muslims again, right? And that's their excuse was, oh, this was a mistake. We didn't realize that the AI that we set up would do this for other videos. And it's like, well, that's the whole point, is that you don't know how your own systems work, but yet you're asking us to trust you with it.
So YouTube admits responsibility. Does anything change for them going forward, or do you think this would happen again? Well,
they said that they took down the video. I'm like, okay, great, but it's like,
it still reached.
But it's like the whole point. But the whole point is not that literal video. It's like that. This is how your platforms work. And so constantly fiddling around the edges it is not good enough.
So how do we as
fixing the problem shouldn't happen in the first place, right? Imagine if we had, when you look at, for example, the history of drug regulation, right? And so, there's the thalidomide crisis that happened. And before that point, drug companies didn't really have to prove how safe their medicines were, particularly in human trials. And it took, babies that were being born without limbs for people to realize, actually, this should not be the point where we realize that something is unsafe when people are affected by it. We should have rules in place where you have to prove before it goes out into the public that this is safe. And so when you look at how we regulate all kinds of other industries, same with aerospace, same with food, same with all kinds of things, you have to prove before you release it to the public that what you're doing is safe. But when it comes to technology, we don't.
How far away are we from that?
I think that, now that there's a public conversation that's being had, that's like the first step. The fact that I can go to Congress and talk to everybody from like Nancy Pelosi all the way to like Ted Cruz about this issue, and that actually most people now kind of agree that actually there's probably some regulation that needs to be, looked at for these companies. I like actually what's happening with, and the Canadian Parliament's actually taking a lead role in this. With 16 countries, the legislative committees at the national parliaments who are responsible for technology are all meeting together in a couple of weeks in Ottawa to talk about, is there some kind of international coordinating framework that we can use to start discussing how to regulate minimum standards, minimum ethical standards for social media. So I think, these are like preliminary steps towards like a safer, more responsible internet, but there's still like quite a bit of work to do, and it's a hard problem. Like it's there's no easy answers to this. Every policy decision, every rule is going to have a plus and a minus, and I think but at least we're having a conversation about it.
And do you believe it's actually possible? And if so, what kind of consequences need to be in place for companies that break the rules?
Well, so this is the other problem, is that there's no real consequence to like, it's funny, undermining democracy is not a crime. I've had several lawyers and also like regulatory bodies tell this to me when I was whistleblowing last year, is that actually it's terrible, but it's technically not criminal, right? And wow, okay. And even where a company does have massive data breaches, which are then used to manipulate an election, there isn't actually much penalty there. And when you look at, like, for example, the history of like seatbelts and cars, like safety in cars and airbags, it was actually because in the United States, the insurance sector, and this is probably the only good thing that the insurance industry has ever done in the United States, was tired of paying for the costs of people in car accidents. And so they actually went to Congress and lobbied against the auto industry to say why we need to make seatbelts and airbags mandatory in cars. And the auto industry said, oh, well, this is going to inhibit innovation, it's going to make things more costly, it's going to scare people. We let people have the choice if they want a seatbelt or not. And hey ho, this is like exactly what the tech industry is saying right now. In that instance, there was a clear financial interest for the insurance companies to go and lobby Congress, right? And unfortunately, right now, there isn't that same kind of market pressure because, we all talk about data as being super valuable and super powerful, and it's like, except when it's breached or leaked or whatever, in which case there is no way of putting value on that problem. So if we required, for example, insurance for data breaches, you could create the same kind of dynamic where an insurance company could go to a big tech company and say, we won't insure you unless you fix your shit. And if you're not insured, you can't have this platform. And there you go. All of a sudden you create a dynamic, right? Or if you actually, the other problem is that when you are a software engineer or a data scientist or an architect of some kind, you don't actually have skin in the game, right? So you can build something for a big company, right? And if it turns out to go wildly wrong, or if it actually is unlawful or whatever. It's the company that's liable, it's not you. And from the company's perspective, this might be the cost of doing business. We pay a fine, whatever, right? When you look at other industries, right, if you look at nurses, teachers, doctors, lawyers, like what have you, they all have professional conduct standards, which includes ethical behavior. We hold a nurse to a higher standard of behavior because they're in a position which is quite powerful in the domain that they work in. And so that means that if you want to call yourself a nurse or a teacher or a doctor or whatever, you have to act ethically. And if a hospital, for example, asked a nurse to do something unethical, the nurse has a professional obligation to say no. And the hospital is not allowed to retaliate against that nurse, at least in theory, not allowed to retaliate against that nurse for saying, no, that's unethical. Same with a lawyer in a law firm or a doctor or what have you, right? But when it comes to technology, if you're an engineer and you're given the task of building something that will create more addiction, that will create, unhealthy body images, that will potentially spread hate propaganda in a country that's at risk of ethnic violence, you don't have any obligation to say no, even if you want to, right? And so I think that actually really starting to unpack, like, if you want to work in data science or in engineering, should we have minimum ethical standards imparted upon people who want to call themselves an engineer or a data scientist, so that they are, both obligated and empowered to tell companies, no, this is unethical, or we need to test this, right? And so I think actually creating both market pressures, but then also pressures from the inside of a company to start instilling a greater culture of ethics could be really helpful, beyond just rules imposed on the companies.
But how much harder is it to create something like that in the field of, computer science and engineering versus you look at nursing, provincially regulated or federally regulated for other industries?
Well, like engineers, like civil engineers are regulated.
But if they're working for these big companies that are worldwide and have impacts in different countries around the world, is that an easy thing to do?
No, but it doesn't mean that we shouldn't actually, nor is climate change. Climate change isn't easy to fix, but that's not an excuse to not talk about it and try to figure out how we can start to work together. You have the same problem with the internet as you do with climate change, which is it's kind of like no one's responsibility and it's very international, but there's clear harms that are coming from it. And so when you look at what happens with climate change, we've got UN, frameworks that countries operate in. You've got treaty level negotiations. You also have, all kinds of international coordinating bodies. I don't think it needs to be that bureaucratic for the internet, but I think that, having that mindset of actually we do need to start to create a common framework of ethics for these social platforms. And, it might be that if we have, like is happening right now, 16 countries and legislators all working together to try to figure out what would that common set of rules look like, I think that's the first step. But it's a really hard problem. It's not easy. And
something that could take years and years to build upon. What's the damage that could be done to society, do you think, if
Have you seen the movie WALL-E?
I have not.
Right, so if you look at the movie WALL-E, like, I actually find that movie terrifying because if you look at sort of what WALL-E is, it's the total environmental destruction of our planet, and humanity then lives on these spaceships where they become sort of like infantilized blobs that live in their personal entertainment systems. And I kind of feel like that's the future that we're heading for, right? Environmental destruction and total infantilization of like human society. And when you look at, and it's not just what's happening right now with like ad networks, right? It's like, which already is having an impact on, our political discourse and our mental health. But when you look at, the developments of 5G, which is, already in China and, soon coming to lots of other countries, right? Which will enable the quote unquote Internet of Things, where like your toothbrush can order, make a dentist appointment for you, and your sofa talks to your fridge, and your fridge talks to your car, and your car talks to the road and decides whether you should be late or not for work, depending on your subscription package. But you know, when you take a look at that and you go, all right, particularly when you look at like the patents that Google and Facebook and Amazon are all applying for right now, they're all essentially creating surveillance networks inside of your home. And the reason why they want to do that is once 5G comes about, once Internet of Things materializes, everything can watch you. And if everything can watch you and think about you, and you as a company can not only control what people see online, but all of a sudden you can sort of devolve that down into the physical space. As a person, for the first time in human history, you will be inside of an environment that is not passive, an environment that watches you, thinks about you, and constantly is seeking to subtly change your behavior, where it can see you, but you can't see it. And for me, that's like quite godlike if you think about it, right? Something that sees you, watches you all the time, has a framework of behavior that it wants you to follow, and then either penalizes or rewards you according to that set of rules, right? And if it means that all of a sudden your living room constantly thinks about how it can make money off of you, right? You know, or your children's toys watch your kids, right? Your toilet analyzes your shit, like literally everything, right? It's like, and that all of that goes to a set of companies who, again, don't do anything when the United Nations says you are contributing to ethnic cleansing. I feel like that's a recipe for disaster. And we like have this sort of feeling that like we've got a government and there's like a captain of the ship and there's like people in charge of stuff. But when the sea itself becomes motivated, right? You might still have a government on that ship, but if the ocean itself decides to change, it doesn't matter if you have a captain or how big your ship is, it's still sitting in this ocean. And so this is why I find it quite concerning that we are just blindly and rapidly running into these sort of new technical architectures, both online and offline, without even like the minimum requirements of, you know, engineers and data scientists having to give some due consideration to the ethical implications of what they're doing. And so I think that's scary. And I think Wall-E is a terrifying future. And so like, I think we need to start thinking about it.
What's one of the scariest devices or platforms that's out there right now that's commonly used in your eyes?
Well, look at what China's doing, man. Like setting up a citizen scoring program, right? Where the Chinese government is taking as many data sources about its citizens as possible to create a quote unquote trustworthiness score. And the reason why China is the leader in 5G and why the Chinese government has invested so much in 5G is because 5G will take that to the next level, where everything that a Chinese citizen touches becomes a point of surveillance and influence for the state. And you know, we can sit back and go, okay, but yeah, we live in Canada, or we live in Britain, or EU, or whatever, and we've got a democracy. But you know, a private company almost is more scary because they don't have. You know, we treat private companies as if, you know, they're somehow less powerful than a government. Look at what Facebook has done, and look at how it has been incredibly difficult for any national government. And let me tell you, I have gone and testified and worked with regulatory authorities in I don't know how many countries now, and they all say the same thing. We don't know how to regulate this company because it's too big, right? If you've got even the European Union going, this is like too big for us to handle, right? This shows what power these companies can have. And so then look at what's happening in China and transplant that here, but instead you've got a private company, which again won't do anything about ethnic cleansing. That's its moral standard, right? So that I find freaky. So I think that, you know, if there's, look at what what's happening in other places, you know, if you want a scary example. But I think like even, you know, I had a conversation, I won't name the company, because I work in the private sector. I am, just for disclosure, I am a data scientist, and I work in building software for a Fortune 500 company. But even, I had this really weird meeting with, it was a large American company. It wasn't in fashion. It was a large sort of drugstore company, I'll put it. And they were freaking out about Amazon Alexa, because Alexa, found out that Alexa is recording every time somebody says, like, is pharmacy X open, to create profiles of people to anticipate when it is that they want some Tylenol, with the idea that at some point there'll be some kind of thing inside of your home that can be loaded with Tylenol and it'll dispense it. And so this company was like, and it's a big ass American company, and they're freaking out because they're like, the only way that we could compete with that is if we also created a competing surveillance network in a person's living room. And like, how creepy is that? That it's like, you know, and then also it's interesting because I think also the private sector, you know, no set of angels, but like even the private sector is starting to realize, hey, wait a second, if we allow total corporate hegemony of these tech companies, we don't even have a business anymore. Because if Amazon becomes everything to us, you know, or Facebook becomes everything to us, then that it's just an omni sector, right? And what's scary about that is that when you look at what happens when you completely eliminate, you know, any kind of sort of market competition, you create hyper-dominant forces in companies, you get egregious abuses of consumer rights and indeed human rights. And also, like, it would suck if like Amazon was your sole source of anything, right? Can you imagine? It's like, you know, they're going into fashion now, not to like slag off Amazon, but like, I mean, I'm sorry, like if Amazon becomes everything from like your drugstore to your like clothing company to like whatever, what a dull fucking world we live in.
Well, it's already on its way, so. Is there anything that people here in this room can do to confront disinformation?
No, not really. I mean, I think that...
We should just end it right there then.
Well, the way I look at it is it's like, I don't mean that flippantly. I mean, it's sort of, it's like if we were to say there's architects out there and they're building buildings without fire exits, right? And they're putting terms and conditions on the door that say, you agree to enter a building, which we might make into a maze, so it's really hard to leave, and also the wiring is faulty and there's no fire exits because of our like user experience philosophy, right? And then asking, what should we do about the buildings that don't have fire exits? Well, it's like, that's not your problem. Stop making fucking buildings without fire exits, right? And so actually, you know, this is exactly the sort of frame of mind that a lot of these large tech companies want, because implicit in that question, and sorry, I'm not meaning it to be overly critical, but implicit in that question is an assumption that people should be responsible. And I'm saying no, citizens should not be responsible. Tech companies that are building these things should be responsible. So it's like, what can you do? Well, like, be angry about it and call your MP or like call Facebook, but like, unfortunately, you can't actually do anything about an architecture that you don't have power over.
Tech companies should be responsible, but you don't think that people here, that you and I have a responsibility to protect ourselves and to try and make change?
Would you say that about a drug company?
Well,
would you say that about? Would you say that about, you know, a food company that is knowingly putting poisonous additives to their food? Would you say that about an airline company that doesn't make safe airplanes? What is the responsibility of the consumer? No, it's the responsibility of a company that is exploiting resources in an unsafe way to make money. They have the power, they have the know-how, they own the platforms, they are responsible.
And so until that happens, is it not our responsibility to also know what we're getting into, know what we're letting into our lives?
You can know as much as you want about these things, but like, what's that going to do? You still click accept on these fucking terms and conditions. And that's not your fault, because like, I'm sorry, if you want a job, you have to use LinkedIn. If you want to like work in your office, you need to use Google services. If you want to have a social life, you've got to use Instagram, WhatsApp, Facebook, whatever, right? So like, it's like you can go in with your eyes wide open. And I think a lot of people know that these companies do really shady things, but they don't have a choice, because it's like, you know, electricity. You can't, you know, if you actually want to preserve your privacy rights, currently the only way that you could do that is go and live in the forest, because there's no part. It is, try using the internet where you don't touch any website that touches Google Display Network, right? Or Facebook Display Network, you don't even have to go on Facebook for Facebook to start tracking you, right? And so it's a very, you can say, sure, people should know about it, and I think they should, but it's not going to change their behavior, because unfortunately a lot of these platforms are now in a position where they are essential. And you know what we do with things that are essential? We regulate them like a utility, right? Electricity, water, transportation, right? They're regulated like utilities because you can't live without them. And the internet is frankly a utility. People engage with these platforms like a utility. And so, you know, we should, and when you look at how utilities are regulated, it doesn't matter you know, what they put in terms of contracts. There are statutory obligations that supersede any contractual thing to protect consumers, because consumers don't have a choice.
Okay.
So if you want to do something, like, get pissed off about it and, like, call your MP or email them, or, like, you know, like,
and
organize.
So from a data and privacy perspective, there's no recommendation for what students here should do in their personal lives besides going to your MP and making noise about it?
I mean, just be aware that what, you see, here's the thing, right? It's like, you're taking on something. So I'll give you another example. Like, imagine if your cousin goes to, like, Ancestry, DNA, blah, 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 whatever, right? And let's say they live in the United States. It's a bit different in Canada because we've got public health care. But let's say you're in the United States, right? And your cousin now goes because, you know, they want to know where they're from. Cool, great. Let's say then this company 20 years from now gets acquired by a large health insurance company. And then all of a sudden, boom, you're faced with your health insurance being cut at the end of the year because you are genetically related to this person, and they've identified that they have a heritable disease which you have a 70% chance of getting. All right, cool. You didn't even have to do anything, right? It was your cousin 20 years ago. This is what I'm saying, is it's like, you can try all you want, but it is a large informational architecture that you're in, and unfortunately, like, hate to be the bearer of bad news, but you can't individually do anything about it. You can't protect yourself against it. What I would say, though, is that collectively we can, and collectively we can demand that our governments, you know, require higher standards of behavior for these companies. You know, if you're a shareholder of Facebook, sell your shares. You know, like, other than that, I don't know what you can do as a person.
Okay.
Sorry.
I mean, you just really killed the mood in here, but.
Get pissed off about it.
Okay, so we have time for one more question before we go to the audience.
Okay.
And, you know, you have said that blowing the whistle on Cambridge Analytica was all worth it because it created the conversation.
Yeah.
Did you ever imagine it would have created this big of a conversation?
No. But, like, I think that Facebook itself created the conversation. When you know, Facebook wasn't the primary focus of the whistleblowing. It was Steve Bannon and the alt-right and a bunch of neo-Nazi racists that are, like, infiltrating our politics. And, you know, the response when Facebook found out that The Guardian was investigating was, first, so on the day that they found out, they sent a letter to The Guardian. And they say, none of this is true. We're going to sue you in court for defamation. Same day, same lawyer sends a letter to me going, it's all true, but it's your fault, so we're going to report you to the FBI, right? Not realizing that I was actually working with the authorities and they were the subject of an investigation. They then find out that the ICO, which is the regulator for privacy and data in the UK, who's run, the Information Commissioner, who, by the way, is from British Columbia. There's a lot of Canadians involved in this. Anyway, but when they found out that they were seeking a warrant to Cambridge Analytica to get access to the servers, Facebook then flies engineers overnight from Silicon Valley to London, goes into Cambridge Analytica to try to take the servers, where the ICO had to literally call the police and threaten them with arrest and deportation if they didn't voluntarily drop the it was like a whole thing. Drop it in the middle of the night, like movie style, right? Drop the servers, get out of this office and leave this fucking country because you are at risk of obstructing justice here, right? So then what do? They then decide to release a press release that says, oh, we're going to ban this whistleblower. He's bad. It's not our fault. It's other people, and he's bad. No real context or rationale other than we don't like this guy. You know, and what's interesting about their behavior is that every step of the way, they tried to deny, deflect, obfuscate. They hired speaking of disinformation, out of one side of their mouth they go, oh, disinformation, it's really a bad thing. We're going to try really hard to like stop it, Congress. They then hire, a private communications firm to literally create fake news about a Soros Jewish conspiracy to take on American industry, right? Where I could then get accused by the alt-right of being a Soros-funded thing, right? And, they literally hired this firm. They literally hired a firm to create like anti-Semitic fake news to attack people who were critical of them, right? They threatened to sue journalists. You know, when the CTO at the British Parliament was asked by the committee, why is it that you knowingly lied to The Guardian and threatened journalists with defamation suits, frivolous defamation suits that you knew were bullshit? And why did you do that? And the response was, we thought that's just how you engage with journalists. Literally, that's what he said. The CTO, right? Fucking bullshit, man. This is what this company is. So did I realize that this was going to be such a big story, particularly as it relates to tech rather than just the alt-right or Russia or all that? No, not really, because I didn't realize, even I didn't realize how many douchebags run Facebook. Like, and they did it themselves. They shot themselves in the foot over and over and over again. Rather than saying, I'm sorry, we fucked up. We were asleep at not only we were asleep at the wheel, you had people like Sheryl Sandberg who were warned by their internal, I even talked to Facebook. I talked to Facebook. Sheryl Sandberg was warned by her internal security team, given a memo. What did she do? They fired them. The safety engineers inside of Facebook who warned the board said, you shouldn't have told us that, you're fired, right? Like, fucking bullshit. And so I didn't anticipate how corporate this corporation was, and that actually they're just like an oil company. They're just like a big pharma company. They're like any other big company. They care about their shareholders, and that's it. Okay. The end.
On that note, we're going to take questions from the audience. Katie's going to go around with a mic. We're going to do this side of the room first. So if you guys have questions on this side, just hold off. We'll do 10 minutes here and then 10 minutes here. All right, so if you have questions, put up your hand and Katie will come over to you with the mic. Really? No questions?
Hey, thanks for the talk today. I thought that was a really great question that answer to the this question: what can we do as individuals to fight back against disinformation? That was a really intelligent answer. You know, this is a political problem without personal solutions. Anyway, sorry. My question is, in your time at Cambridge Analytica, really interested in understanding how the information that got scraped from Facebook gets turned into disinformation. Because I think there's sort of when you read the news, there's sort of a black boxing of what's actually sort of going on the inside. So I was wondering if you could say a bit about what the most valuable types of information that were sort of taken from these scrapes and how those sort of get turned, like, because 80 million users, right? So how does that information sort of get turned into things that can be processed and analyzed and turned into manipulation?
Yeah, so one of the things that kind of, I agree, and this is one of the frustrations that I had, but you know, a newspaper doesn't want to sort of wax lyrical on technical details, so they just go, oh, there was this black box thing that did stuff. So I actually started, Cambridge Analytica, like when I started, it didn't actually exist. I worked for a military contractor, and our clients were like the Pentagon, Ministry of Defense, NATO, and we actually, ironically, were working on counter-propaganda R&D for Western militaries with a particular focus on North Africa and the Middle East. And so I think an important thing to understand is that Cambridge Analytica actually was the rebranding of a military contractor. When you look at whether it's counterinsurgency operations or indeed insurgency catalyzation in the military. So, for example, if you take a large narcotics operation in Colombia, one of the things that traditionally is done is identifying people who exhibit particular traits or behaviors with like actual human intel, like on the ground. It's very time-consuming and risky and all that. They identify people who are likely more prone to conspiratorial thinking, or are narcissistic, or ambitious, or neurotic, or what have you, and those people are then fed ideas. What we were looking at was, could you scale that? Because when you look at ISIS or Boko Haram or what have you, these were organizations that were all recruiting and organizing online. So could we do the same thing where we identify people who are more vulnerable or have particular psychological vulnerabilities that can be exploited to undermine a recruitment effort, organizational effort, or a leadership structure, et cetera? It was offensive, psychological informational weaponry that we were building. When Steve Bannon was told he can't actually become a client because it was military research, he then got a billionaire to then buy the company. And the idea is that if you bought the company, you could extract the IP anyway, right? And so then they, lo and behold, they rebranded it as Cambridge Analytica. What they did, and the whole point of the data, which by the way wasn't actually scraped from Facebook, Facebook authorized it. Facebook authorized it through their application procedures. Their excuse was they didn't actually read the terms and conditions of the app when they approved it. But they did actually hire some of the people who worked on the CA project after the pilot, because they were really interested in optimizing their ads. And when you look at the role of data, it would serve in the same way as your human intelligence operative inside of an organization, where you would try to identify people who were more prone, or likely to be more prone, to neurotic traits, conspiratorial thinking, etc. And the things that they like, the things that they engage in, post about, the language and semantics that they use is distinct from the, quote, norm of society. So the whole point of the profiling was to identify your initial target audience. Once that audience would be identified, ads would be sent to them to get them to join a group or a page or a forum. And I think this is where the sort of the gap in the public reporting has been, is that it wasn't just ads. Ads were the first step. The whole point was to gain informational dominance around that person. So they would recruit somebody to a group, and then they join a Facebook group. And Facebook's newsfeed AI was very sensitive, at least at the time. So if you joined a group that was quite different from most other likes or pages, it would consider this as the thing that makes you unique. So it would try to recommend things that were similar. So immediately, Facebook would do half of the work, because their newsfeed would then all of a sudden just start recommending alt-right propaganda at these people. But they would join the group, and then they would get a message: hey, I'm Joe from Outta County, but welcome to this group. Have you checked out this thing? Can you believe like this is happening? And so people would start literally having chats with, semi-automated people to talk about all of these things that are quote unquote happening that no one's talking about. And once these groups would reach a certain threshold, a couple thousand people, and they would be geographically focused, so by county usually, then an event would be set up. And so, if you think about, if on average between 5 and 10% of people would attend a live event, but if you set it up in like a coffee shop and you get a couple hundred people all flooding a coffee shop, from the perspective of those people, like, holy shit, everyone thinks this. Everyone's talking about this. And, their sort of digital fantasy then becomes their temporal reality, because they're literally staring face to face with another average Joe who might be like a plumber or whatever, doesn't have any quote unquote political agenda. And they're all talking about, bullshit. But they reinforce each other. And then all of a sudden they go, everybody in my community is talking about these things, and yet when I go on CNN or read the New York Times, none of this is talked about. But obviously it's happening. Everyone's talking about it. But they have an agenda. That's why. They're fake news, right? And so these people would then start to self-organize, right? And so you can think of it like a sleeper cell. It's insurgency building. Literally, this is how systematic insurgency building works. And the whole point of Steve Bannon acquiring SCL Group, this contractor, and converting it into Cambridge Analytica was because he wanted to use that same kind of tactic and create insurgencies in the United States. And that's what he did. And once those groups started self-organizing, they'd be introduced county A to county B to county C, and boom, you've got a statewide organization. And that's how you catalyze a movement. And that's the whole point of CA. And the thing that I think was missed is that what CA did wasn't brainwashing. It wasn't somehow like mind controlling, like, 60% of the population. It was targeting, 2-3% of the population. But particularly when it comes to elections, there's zero-sum games. You always have a winner and a loser. So if you get one more vote, you win 100% of that election. So these people were like absolutely critical. And they found a way to, not only convert them into voters, but actually mobilize them into a movement, which then in turn recruited more people. So if that answers your question.
Okay, do we have another question?
Thank you. So this is in regards to what you said earlier about the alt-right. And I was just wondering if, like, when you look at the alt-right online, you always see that all their hate speech, it's often disguised as free speech. So do you think if any regulation were to happen, like actual regulation were to happen, do you think that would be a motive to radicalize the already existing alt-right online?
Would tech regulation radicalize the alt-right, is what you're saying?
Yes, like under the premise that, they're being silenced in that sense, right?
Would it matter? Because if you actually created an informational environment that created barriers to propagating hate speech, then they can get mad all they want, but it's not going to spread like wildfire like it currently does. So I would kind of say I don't really care. If that, not to be flippant about it, but like, does that kind of make sense? Like, as in, if, all right, you want to create lots of hate propaganda about Muslims, but rather than catalyzing the spread of that because it gets more clicks, if you inhibit and slow down and create road bumps for things like that, then it's going to spread less quickly. And so I think that it doesn't really matter if they get angry about it, because they will no longer have a platform that gives them a disproportionate advantage in propagating their hate speech.
Well said. We have another question, I think. The mic's over there.
You talked a lot about regulation and the importance of the government actually acting towards regulating big tech companies.
Yeah.
How would you get them to actually care? Because I think the government in itself, they could have a lot of interest in getting that data and, as you said, possibly tilting the election results. So how would you actually get the government to care towards protecting?
How to get the government to care, or how to get tech companies to care?
No, the government to
how
actually
to get the government
promote
to care.
regulation against tech companies, yeah.
Making it a political issue. Parties want to win voters, right? So if people talk about this and say, this is what I care about, then you're going to have political parties that are going to have to respond to a policy demand from people. And also I think that there's a lot of governments, having spoken to a lot of governments, who are getting really effing pissed off at these companies because ignoring requests. Mark Zuckerberg still refuses to attend any other parliament to testify except Congress, because he knows that he's going to get a lot tougher questions from MPs or what have you that they haven't bought off with campaign donations, and I think that there are quite a few governments that are finding you look at the European Union, for example, it is really worried about the spread of disinformation, particularly Russian propagated disinformation, because it's threatening the EU itself and the functioning of the EU itself. Countries that have separatist movements, that have histories of ethnic violence, they all a lot of them don't want that to be catalyzed, and platforms currently are. So I think it's not to say the government doesn't care. I think that it cares, but it kind of ranks things in order of how much should I care. And so I think getting people to talk about stuff more will up the priority to actually take action.
We have a question on this side.
Hey, Chris. Thanks for coming. What does your shirt say?
Oh, it's funny. It says second referendum now. I got it given to me. And then actually, speaking of, on the back of it, it has a letter to your MP in Britain that you can.
Yeah. So my question is, you're speaking to a future policymakers. There's a few of us in here who are doing our research and our theses in Masters in Public Policy. Cool. And my question to you is, some of the recommendations that have been brought forward by, Roger McNamee and Siva via scholars essentially is regulation can either nibble around the edges by, making these algorithms public or, stuff like that, or the major one is to break up these companies, right? That's like the big thing.
I mean, edge nibbling is fine, but I think there needs to be more sort of fundamental change. I think one of the things that hasn't really been talked about enough, so the breaking up tech companies, I think is something that we really need to start looking at, because if you've got a company like Amazon that operates in every industry that you can think of, it risks becoming, if it hasn't already become, a monopoly. Same with Facebook, the owning Instagram and all kinds of other companies. But I think that one of the things that really needs to be considered is how these companies will exist no matter what. You can break up Facebook, but Facebook's still going to exist, or whatever form it exists in. And like, companies just have a tendency to, you could break it up, but then 20 years later, it'll sort of conglomerate, right? And so I think really starting to ask the question, like, how can we get like engineers and people inside of these companies to like internalize, not only internalize compliance, but internalize like a will to be more ethical, right? And I think like literally professional standards and ethical and requiring ethics. If you want to call yourself a software engineer, you have to agree to a framework of ethics, and where if you put skin in the game, right, where it is no longer an excuse to say, well, I was just following orders, they told me to, my manager told me to build this thing, and I did, and actually it's the company that's liable, not me, right? If all of a sudden you as an engineer in whatever company, all of a sudden, just like a nurse or a teacher or whatever, are asked to do something that's unethical and you go along with it, the consequence not only is just for the company, but it becomes for you personally, because, if you are a lawyer or a doctor or a teacher or a nurse or whatever, you behave unethically, you might not be allowed to practice your profession. And so all of a sudden, that means that you have to take ethics really seriously, because if you get disbarred or banned from practicing medicine or nursing or whatever, what are you going to do then, right? So I think that not only looking at breaking up tech companies or transparency for AI and whatnot, but also trying to figure out how to create internalized cultures of compliance and ethics is something that's really important. And I also think that there needs not only skin in the game for the people who make these things, but there needs to be skin in the game for companies, and that means money. And so I think looking at, for example, should tech companies have mandatory requirements to be insured against data breaches, where, for example, if you are one of the victims of a data breach, you get compensated for it, will create an externalized financial pressure on a company, because all of a sudden an insurance company will go in and say, like, stop fucking around or we won't insure you, and you're going to have to figure out how you're going to continue operating your like unlawful platform, right? So I think looking at policies that instill internal cultures that are more compliant and ethical, and then also like creating not just fines, like state-run fines, but also market pressures and financial market pressures, and giving value to data not just to exploit in ad networks, but also the flip side of value, which is if you lose it, you have to pay for it. So I think those are two things that, in addition to all the other things that are currently being discussed.
Okay, we have time for one more question. He's already got the mic. Sorry, guys.
So the question I have is it possible to, and what would the effects be if you just make it illegal to have targeted advertising?
So I think that would be really difficult, because what is targeting, right? Like, and also, like, I hate spam, and I think most people hate spam. So like, I don't need to see shit that I don't want. Like, I don't need, like, you know, retirement home adverts and tampon adverts, right? Like, I just don't, it's not relevant to me. I don't really want to see that. Other people might, because it's more relevant to them. So I don't have a problem per se with targeting. It's like, it's what is allowed and not allowed to be targeted. But that's a hard one to answer, because, you know, if you look at what's just happened with Facebook, where, you know, rental companies were excluding African Americans and people of color from advertising their properties. And then when Facebook goes, oh, okay, we just, for the rental markets, we won't allow you to target race, but then getting around that by targeting particular musical artists or excluding people who like particular music artists, and then proxy, you know, create racial profiling. So it's not, so it's a hard one. I don't think banning targeting is realistic. And also, you know, there's a lot of, I think particularly also in politics, like, there's so much noise now in the media landscape and the informational landscape that there is a legitimate case to be made about, like, saying, all right, well, this person cares about this thing, so I should be responding to that demand. They want me to talk about climate change because that's what they care about. Well, I will tell them what I think about climate change rather than retirement policy, right? And that's, I think, an important part of a functioning democracy, is responding to what different people want. But at the same time, it's kind of a hard problem. Sorry, that was like I'm almost like a politician. That was like the most non-answer answer ever.
All right.
It's a hard one. Yeah.
That's it for today. For the questions, we're going to bring Sabrina back up on stage, and yeah.
Yeah, so that's all that we have for questions today. And wow, that was a really, really wonderful sort of conversation, very mentally stimulating, so I really appreciate that. But thank you all for your questions, and please, let's give a big hand to Christopher and Anita. So for some closing words, I will hand this over to Landon Hoyt, who is the program manager at SFU's Public Square. Please give him some love.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. Thank you, Anita and Christopher. This was an awesome conversation, and I'm happy that you were both able to be a part of the Community Summit. A big thank you to all of you and your thoughtful conversation and questions today. I want to take a quick moment to thank our partners that helped make this event happen. Stuart and the team behind the Media Democracy Days at SFU, thank you so much. Phoenix at CBC Vancouver, SFU School of Communication, SFU's Faculty of Communication, Art and Technology, Cobalt Strategy Group, and Cineras. Thank you for helping us organize this and source some questions for today. I also want to thank our Community Summit sponsors that include the Jaroslawski Foundation, the City of Vancouver, and Microsoft. Without them, this event would not be possible. So Christopher Wylie will be speaking again tonight at the Queen Elizabeth Theatre alongside David Frum and Sue Gardner and Ian Hannah-Mansing. The event is sold out, unfortunately, so if you do not have tickets, we do have a live webcast that will start at 7 p.m. You can find that on our website at sfu.ca/public square, so tune in if you can't join us tonight. But thanks, help me in giving one more round of applause to Anita and Chris. Thanks so much.